The first envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning. It was waiting inside my mailbox beneath a grocery flyer and the electric bill, thick enough that I knew it wasn't another neighborhood newsletter before I even picked it up. By the time I reached my front porch overlooking the lake, I had already noticed the return address. Our homeowners association. I set my coffee on the railing and opened the envelope carefully. The letter inside informed me that I was financially responsible for delaying the community's shoreline improvement project because I had refused to cooperate with construction crews. According to the notice, the association intended to recover additional project costs from me if the matter was not resolved immediately. I read the page twice. Then I looked out toward my dock. The water was perfectly still. A pair of ducks drifted quietly between the pilings my father and I had installed more than 30 years earlier. Nothing about that peaceful morning suggested a legal battle had already begun. My first reaction was exactly what most people would expect. I wanted to walk straight to the clubhouse and demand an explanation. I even picked up my truck keys before stopping halfway across the kitchen. My father used to say, "The first person who loses control usually loses the argument." I put the keys back on the counter. Instead, I poured another cup of coffee, carried the letter into my study, and placed it inside a blue folder that had followed me through every major decision of my adult life. Mortgage papers, insurance records, property surveys, maintenance receipts. If it involved this property, it went into that folder. Before doing anything else, I opened the county's online property records and printed a fresh copy of my shoreline survey. It took less than 5 minutes. I had no idea that single sheet of paper would eventually become one of the most important documents in the entire case. Around noon, my neighbor Harold Jensen slowed his riding mower as he passed my driveway. "Everything all right?" he asked after noticing the HOA letter in my hand. I smiled. "Depends who you ask." He laughed, but only for a second. "I've seen those construction crews walking around the shoreline the last couple of weeks," he said. "They've been measuring more than they probably should." It wasn't an accusation, just an observation from someone who spent most mornings outside. After he drove away, I walked down to the dock. The weathered boards creaked beneath my boots exactly the way they always had. I stopped near the end where a faded pencil mark was still visible on one of the support beams. My father had made it while checking a measurement years before he passed away. He refused to sand it away because, as he liked to joke, if the measurement was right once, it'll still be right tomorrow. I rested my hand on that old beam for a moment before looking across the lake toward the freshly installed construction fencing on the opposite shoreline. Heavy equipment sat parked behind it, silent for now. Something about the layout bothered me, though I couldn't explain why. The access route looked closer to my property than I remembered from the public meeting months earlier. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I wasn't. Either way, I took several photographs from different angles before heading back inside. They cost me nothing but a few minutes. Later, they would become far more valuable than I could have imagined. That evening, I attended the monthly HOA meeting carrying nothing except the blue folder and a notepad. Vanessa Holloway, the HOA president, greeted homeowners with the same confident smile she always wore. When public comments began, I stood and calmly asked a simple question. Could someone explain why I received a letter claiming I delayed a project that has never entered my property? Vanessa barely glanced at the notice before sliding it back across the table. "Our records indicate the project has proceeded appropriately," she replied. "If you have concerns, you can submit them in writing." A few people nodded as though the matter had already been settled. I thanked her, returned to my seat, and wrote down her exact words. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply wrote. As the meeting ended, homeowners filed quietly toward the parking lot. I was almost to my truck when Harold caught up with me again. He looked back toward the clubhouse before speaking. "You know," he said quietly, "those crews weren't measuring your dock." I frowned. "Then what were they measuring?" He hesitated just long enough to make me uneasy. "Your property line." I looked across the darkening lake toward the construction area. Until that moment, I believed the letter in my blue folder was the problem. I was about to discover it was only the invitation. The next morning began the same way most mornings had for years. I carried a mug of black coffee onto the back porch just as the sun climbed over the far side of the lake. The air was cool, and the water reflected the sky so perfectly it almost looked like polished glass. For a few quiet minutes, I let myself believe Harold's comment the night before had simply been an old neighbor's suspicion. Then I noticed fresh tire tracks leading toward the shoreline. They hadn't been there the previous evening. I set my coffee on the railing and walked down the worn wooden steps toward the dock. The closer I got, the more obvious the damage became. One corner of the dock leaned lower than the rest, just enough that years of routine maintenance told me something underneath had shifted. Fresh scrape marks cut across two support beams. Mud-covered boards that should have been clean, and broken reeds floated where the shoreline had been disturbed. I stopped without taking another step. My first instinct was to start checking every board by hand, but I remembered something an old insurance adjuster once told me after a storm damaged a neighbor's boathouse. Take pictures before you take opinions. I pulled out my phone instead. I photographed the dock from every angle I could reach. Wide shots, close-ups, the leaning corner, the scrape marks, the churn mud, the tire impressions near the bank. I even photographed my watch beside a newspaper from that morning so the date couldn't later become a question. Only after nearly 50 photographs did I step onto the dock. It groaned beneath my weight in a way I had never heard before. The sound wasn't dramatic. It was worse than that. It was unfamiliar. Halfway to the end, I noticed one piling had shifted, several inches out of alignment. I didn't need an engineer to know wood doesn't move like that on its own overnight. As I stood there, Harold appeared at the edge of his yard carrying a fishing pole. "Looks worse up close, doesn't it?" he called. I nodded. "Did you see what happened?" He shook his head. "Not the damage itself. But yesterday afternoon, I saw one of the contractor's excavators near the shoreline. They had someone from the HOA talking with the operator before the machine changed direction." "Do you know who it was?" I asked. Harold shrugged. "Couldn't tell from that distance. Just someone wearing one of those bright safety vests." It wasn't much, but it confirmed one thing. The excavator hadn't wandered toward my property by accident. Before going back inside, I walked the shoreline one more time. Near the water's edge, I found a small strip of orange survey ribbon caught beneath a patch of flattened grass. It matched the temporary markers I had seen near the construction area across the lake. I slipped it into a clear plastic bag from my workshop and wrote the date across the label. Maybe it meant something. Maybe it didn't. Either way, I wasn't going to trust my memory over evidence. By early afternoon, I was sitting in the county records office reviewing the shoreline improvement permit. The clerk recognized my address immediately. "We've had several homeowners asking about this project," she said while handing me the file. Inside were engineering drawings, environmental approvals, and the original site access plan presented months earlier during the HOA meeting. I spread the pages across the table. Harold had been right. The approved equipment route stayed comfortably away from my dock. It didn't come close enough to leave the damage now sitting in front of me. I asked whether there had been any revised plans filed after construction began. The clerk searched the system for several minutes before looking back at me. "Not that I can find," she said. "If the route changed, I don't have paperwork showing it." I thanked her, made copies of every approved drawing, and slipped them into the blue folder beside the HOA letter. On the drive home, I kept thinking about one simple question. If the approved route never crossed my shoreline, why had heavy equipment ended up beside my dock? That evening, I spread every photograph and every document across my dining room table. The pictures showed damage. The permit showed where the equipment was supposed to be. Between those two facts was a gap that someone would eventually have to explain. Just before I gathered everything back into the blue folder, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Carter?" the caller asked. "My name is Mark. I'm the project manager for the construction company." He paused for a moment before continuing. "I think there's something you should request before anyone has a chance to misplace it." Then the line went quiet. I stared at my phone for several seconds after the call ended. The project manager hadn't tried to explain anything. He hadn't denied anything either. He had only given me one piece of advice. Request it before someone has a chance to misplace it. I wrote those exact words in my notebook before I even drove home. Experience had taught me that conversations fade. Notes don't. The next morning, I drafted a simple records request asking the contractor for every daily field log, equipment movement record, and work authorization connected to the shoreline project. I sent the request by certified mail and by email before 8 o'clock. Then I waited. Around lunchtime, another envelope arrived. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was from the county assessor's office, containing the updated shoreline survey I had requested online a few days earlier. I spread it across my dining room table beside the original plat map my father had kept for decades. At first glance, they looked identical. Then I noticed something interesting. The legal boundary hadn't changed, but the survey included a newer reference marker that wasn't shown on the older copy. It gave a much clearer measurement from my dock to the neighboring common area. I grabbed a ruler and began comparing distances. If the contractor had followed the approved access route, the excavator should have remained comfortably outside that buffer. Instead, the damage on my dock suggested the machine had crossed directly into it. I wasn't ready to call that proof, but it was enough to make me ask better questions. That afternoon, I drove back to the shoreline. Construction had paused for the day, leaving only stacks of materials and a silent excavator parked near the temporary fencing. I stayed on my side of the property line and took another series of photographs. This time I focused on the ground instead of the dock. Deep track marks cut through the soil before disappearing beneath fresh gravel that looked noticeably newer than the surrounding surface. Someone had tried to smooth the area, but heavy equipment always leaves a story behind if you know where to look. While I was photographing the tracks, a county inspector pulled into the construction entrance. He recognized me from the records office the previous day. "Back again?" he asked with a smile. Trying to understand what happened, I replied. He glanced toward the excavator before lowering his voice. "Just remember something. Approved plans don't change because someone points in a different direction on the job site." I looked at him. "So if the route changed?" He finished the sentence for me. "There should be paperwork." He climbed back into his truck before I could ask anything else. It wasn't much, but it echoed exactly what the county clerk had already told me. Every legitimate change leaves a paper trail. Late that afternoon, I finally decided it was time to speak with Vanessa face to face. I found her outside the clubhouse reviewing landscaping invoices with another board member. She greeted me politely, though the smile faded as soon as she saw the blue folder under my arm. "I wanted to ask about the construction route," I said calmly. "The approved plans don't appear to match what happened near my property." Vanessa folded her arms. "The contractor handled the work according to project needs." "Was the route changed?" I asked. "Minor field adjustments happen on every construction project." "Do those adjustments require documentation?" Her expression tightened for just a moment. "You'll have to ask the contractor about their paperwork." It was a careful answer. She hadn't actually said the paperwork existed. She also hadn't said it didn't. As I turned to leave, I noticed the other board member watching the conversation without saying a word. He looked uncomfortable, almost as if he had expected a different question. Driving home, I kept replaying Vanessa's response in my head. She had redirected every question toward the contractor. Yet the contractor's project manager was the one who had quietly told me to request the records before they disappeared. Those two conversations didn't fit together. One of them suggested there was nothing unusual about the project. The other suggested someone was already worried about documents going missing. The following morning, a large certified envelope arrived from the contractor. Inside were copies of the daily field logs I had requested. I flipped through page after page until one entry stopped me cold. The excavator had been ordered to stop work for several minutes, pending field authorization. When operations resumed, a single sentence had been added beneath the delay. "Alternate access route approved by HOA representative." There was no name, no explanation, just one line that changed everything. For the first time since this began, I wasn't looking at assumptions anymore. I was looking at evidence that someone outside the construction company had made the decision to move that excavator toward my property. For the first time since the letter arrived, I felt something close to certainty. Not confidence, certainty. The contractor hadn't blamed a machine failure or bad weather. Their own records showed the excavator had stopped until someone representing the HOA approved a different route. The only question left was who had made that decision and why. I called the number on the project manager's business card. This time he answered almost immediately. "I received the field logs," I said. There was a brief silence before he replied. "Then you've seen the authorization entry." "I have." Another pause followed. "You should ask for the daily site reports," he said quietly. "The field logs tell you when something happened. The site reports sometimes explain why." Before I could ask another question, he added one final sentence. "Don't wait too long." The call ended exactly as the first one had. He never accused anyone. He simply kept pointing me toward the paperwork. The next morning I sent another certified request, this time asking for the contractor's daily site reports, internal project correspondence related to access changes, and any written instructions issued during construction. Clara Bennett helped me prepare the request. She had spent nearly 20 years handling property disputes and possessed a remarkable ability to remove every unnecessary word from a letter. "Don't argue," she told me as we reviewed the final draft. "Just ask for records. Facts make stronger witnesses than opinions." It was the first time we had worked together, but something about her calm approach reminded me of my father. She never sounded impatient. She simply assumed the truth would eventually catch up with everyone involved. 2 days later, Clara called me into her office. Several new documents had arrived from the contractor's attorneys. Most were routine construction reports, but buried halfway through the stack was a daily site report describing the same delay recorded in the field log. This version contained one sentence the field log did not. Crew expressed concern that alternate access could affect adjacent private structures. Clara slid the page toward me. "Read the next paragraph." I did. Site supervisor requested confirmation before proceeding. Authorization received from HOA representative. Work resumed. "So they warned someone first," I said. Clara nodded. "That's what this appears to say." She tapped the page with her pen and noticed something else. I looked again. The report never said the contractor chose the alternate route. It only recorded that authorization had been received. That distinction suddenly felt important. Clara leaned back in her chair. "People often assume construction companies make every decision on a job site," she said. "Sometimes they do. Sometimes they're following instructions." Before leaving her office, we sent preservation letters to both the HOA and the contractor, formally requesting that no emails, text messages, meeting notes, photographs, or project records be destroyed while the matter was under investigation. Clara explained that most organizations took those letters very seriously. "Once they're on notice," she said, "losing documents becomes a much bigger problem." Later that afternoon, Harold knocked on my front door carrying a small flash drive. "Thought you should have this," he said. He explained that one of his security cameras overlooked part of the shoreline. He normally used it to watch his boat lift, but on the afternoon construction crews worked near my property, it had captured more than he realized. We connected the drive to my laptop and watched the recording together. The image wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough to show the excavator stopping exactly where the field log said it had. Several workers stepped away from the machine. A person wearing a bright safety vest walked over from the direction of the HOA work trailer. The group spoke for less than a minute. Then the individual pointed toward my shoreline. Seconds later, the excavator started moving again. Harold paused the video. "I can't identify who that is," he admitted. But whoever it was, the machine didn't move until after that conversation. The timestamp on the video matched the contractor's field log almost to the minute. 2 independent records, one showing the delay, the other showing what happened during it. Clara watched the footage later that evening without saying much. When it finished, she closed the laptop and reached for the growing stack of documents on her desk. "Every piece of evidence we've collected tells the same story," she said. "That's exactly what we want." Before I left, she handed me a copy of the preservation letters we had sent earlier that week. "Now we wait," she said. "Because if the authorization was given in writing, there's probably an email somewhere." She looked at the blue folder resting under my arm and smiled faintly. And emails have a habit of surviving longer than memories. At that moment, I realized we were no longer trying to prove my dock had been damaged. We were trying to discover whether someone had been warned before making the decision that damaged it anyway. While we waited for responses to the preservation letters, life settled into an uncomfortable routine. Every morning, I walked down to the dock with a cup of coffee, not because I expected anything to change overnight, but because I had done it for more than 30 years. The lake didn't know lawyers had become involved. It didn't know engineers were reviewing photographs or that certified letters were crossing the state every afternoon. The water remained calm. The ducks still drifted between the pilings. A great blue heron landed on the far end of the dock almost every sunrise before lifting silently back into the morning sky. Some things refused to hurry, no matter how complicated people made life. I found myself standing in the exact spot where my father and I had finished the dock decades earlier. I could still picture him brushing sawdust from his shirt while studying the finished frame. He wasn't the kind of man who handed out compliments easily. Instead, he ran one hand along the railing, nodded once, and said, "If you build something that carries your family, Build it like your family is worth protecting. At the time, I thought he was talking about lumber and bolts. Years later, I realized he had been talking about responsibility. That dock had carried birthday parties, fishing trips, quiet evenings with my wife Emily, and the last summer before our daughter Rebecca left for college. It was never just a structure sitting over the water. It had quietly become part of our family's history. I was replacing one of the old cleats a few days later when Rebecca called. She had heard about the dispute from Harold's wife before I had a chance to tell her myself. "Dad," she said, "please don't let them wear you down." I laughed softly. "I'm trying not to let them speed me up." She knew exactly what I meant. "Mom would have told you to keep every receipt," she said. I smiled without realizing it. Emily had been even more organized than I was. She labeled storage boxes, filed warranty cards, saved handwritten notes from repairmen who probably assumed no one would ever read them again. After she passed away, I briefly considered throwing away half the file cabinets in my study. Instead, I left everything exactly where she had organized it. Looking back, that may have been one of the smartest decisions I never intentionally made. Before hanging up, Rebecca asked the question everyone else had been asking. "Are you angry?" I looked through the kitchen window toward the dock. Some days, I admitted, especially when I think about how easily this could have been avoided. There was a short silence before I added, "But anger only lasts a few minutes. Paperwork lasts a lot longer." She laughed because it sounded exactly like something my father would have said. That afternoon, Clara stopped by the house instead of asking me to come to her office. We spread every document across my dining room table while sunlight reflected off the lake behind us. The blue folder that had once held only property records now contained photographs, permits, field logs, surveys, certified mail receipts, and notes from every conversation I'd had since the first HOA letter arrived. Clara didn't begin with the newest evidence. She started at the beginning and worked forward, making sure every event matched every document. "Good cases usually aren't won by one dramatic piece of evidence," she said. "They're won when 50 ordinary pieces all point to the same conclusion." As she compared the timeline with the contractor's reports, she suddenly stopped turning pages. "Look at this." She slid one document toward me. It was a pre-construction coordination report that had arrived with the contractor's production records. Buried near the bottom of the page was a recommendation from the site supervisor. Temporary shoreline barriers should be installed before heavy equipment operates within the expanded work corridor adjacent to private structures. I frowned. Those barriers were never installed. Clara nodded. "That's what concerns me." She reached for another photograph I had taken on the first morning. There were no protective barriers anywhere near my property. No temporary supports. No ground protection. Nothing. "If this recommendation was written before construction reached your dock," she said quietly, "someone made a decision not to follow it." She didn't speculate about who. She didn't have to. The report had been written days before the excavator ever reached my shoreline. Someone had been warned that additional protection was recommended. Someone had chosen to proceed without it. Clara carefully placed the report beside the field logs and the security video timeline. Another independent source. Another piece that fit perfectly into the growing picture. As she closed the folder, she looked toward the lake for a long moment before speaking. "We've been proving the damage happened," she said. "I think we're about to start proving it could have been prevented." The next morning, just after sunrise, my phone rang. It was the contractor's attorney. His voice was calm and professional. "Mr. Carter," he said, "we've located a group of internal emails that should have been produced with the original records request." He paused briefly before adding one sentence that immediately erased every peaceful thought the lake had given me that morning. One of those emails discusses the safety recommendation before the access route was changed. Clara was already waiting when I arrived at her office the following morning. She had cleared the conference table except for one slim folder placed neatly in the center. That immediately caught my attention. Until then, every meeting seemed to produce thicker stacks of paper. This folder contained only a handful of pages. "Sometimes," she said as I sat down, "the smallest file changes the biggest case." She opened the folder and handed me the first email. It had been sent by the contractor's project manager 3 days before work reached my section of the shoreline. The subject line was simple: expanded work corridor. I read it slowly. The message warned that moving equipment closer to private waterfront structures increased the likelihood of structural damage and recommended remaining within the original access route approved by the county whenever possible. There was nothing emotional about it. No accusations. Just professional advice from someone trying to prevent a problem before it happened. Clara slid the next page across the table. It was the reply, not from the contractor, from the HOA representative overseeing the project. The response was only 2 sentences long. The board wants to avoid additional delays. Proceed with the revised access plan discussed on site. That was it. No explanation. No engineering analysis. No questions about the risk. Just an instruction to move forward. I looked up from the page. That's the decision. Clara nodded. It's the first written instruction we've seen. She didn't sound excited. She sounded careful, as though she knew there might still be another piece we hadn't found yet. Before either of us said another word, the conference room door opened. Daniel Mercer stepped inside, carrying a long black case. He greeted us, placed the case on the table, and carefully removed several rolled engineering drawings along with a laser measuring device. "I'd like another look at the dock," he said, "now that we know what route they intended to use." Less than an hour later, we were standing on my shoreline. Daniel didn't begin with the damaged corner everyone noticed first. Instead, he walked the entire length of the dock without saying a word. He crouched beside each piling, checked elevations with the laser level, and measured the spacing between every support. Occasionally, he would stop, write one number in his notebook, then continue. Watching him work reminded me of my father measuring lumber before making a single cut. Nothing happened until every measurement made sense. Halfway through the inspection, Daniel stepped off the dock and walked toward the edge of the construction corridor. He stopped beside a shallow depression in the ground where fresh gravel had been spread weeks earlier. Using a small hand trowel, he scraped away the loose surface until compacted soil appeared underneath. Parallel impressions slowly became visible. He looked back at me. These weren't made by pickup trucks. He measured the distance between the impressions, compared them with another page in his notebook, then quietly nodded to himself. They matched the track width of the excavator listed in the contractor's equipment log. Hearing that was different from simply believing it. Until then, I had suspected the machine caused the damage. Now an independent engineer was connecting the physical evidence to the project records. Daniel spent another hour documenting every measurement with photographs, sketches, and GPS coordinates before closing his notebook. "I've inspected a lot of shoreline failures," he said while packing his equipment. "Storms leave one pattern. Age leaves another. Heavy machinery leaves a third." He glanced back toward the damaged piling. "This belongs in the third category." We returned to Clara's office that afternoon just as another email arrived from the contractor's attorneys. Attached was a document neither of us had requested because we hadn't known it existed. It was the minutes from the weekly coordination meeting between the contractor and the HOA representative. One paragraph immediately stood out. Contractor reiterated concern regarding proximity to neighboring private dock. Client acknowledged recommendation and elected to continue with revised access due to scheduling priorities. Clara didn't speak for several seconds. She simply placed the coordination minutes beside the earlier email. Then she lined up the documents in order across the table. The email warning about the risk. The written instruction to proceed. The field log showing the excavator stopped for authorization. The site report documenting the crew's concern. The security video capturing the conversation beside the machine. The engineering measurements matching the equipment tracks. None of the documents contradicted one another. Each one answered a question the previous document had raised. Clara finally broke the silence. "This isn't a missing piece anymore," she said quietly. "It's a chain." She looked at the growing timeline stretched across the conference table before adding one final thought. "And chains are very difficult to break." Just before I left, her assistant stepped into the room holding another envelope that had arrived by overnight courier from the HOA's attorneys. Clara opened it, scanned the first page, and slowly lowered it back onto the table. For the first time since we began working together, I saw genuine surprise on her face. "Well," she said softly, "I didn't expect them to admit that this early." Clara read the letter twice before handing it across the table. "Don't jump ahead," she said. "Read every word." It wasn't an admission of liability. It was something even more useful. The HOA's attorneys acknowledged that an alternate access route had been approved during construction because the original route was considered less efficient. They insisted the decision had been reasonable under the circumstances and denied that anyone expected property damage to occur. I reached the final page and looked up. So they're admitting the route changed. Clara nodded. Yes. But they're arguing the decision itself wasn't negligent. Exactly. She tapped the letter lightly with her pen. And that's a very different argument. Until that moment, the HOA had repeatedly suggested nothing significant had changed during construction. Now, in writing, they had confirmed the alternate route existed. They simply wanted to justify it. Clara placed their letter beside the contractor's email recommending the original access corridor. Watch what happens when these documents are read together, she said. On one page, the contractor recommended staying within the approved route because of the nearby private dock. On the other, the HOA admitted choosing a different route because it would save time. Neither document accused anyone. Neither needed to. Together, they answered the same question from opposite directions. Later that afternoon, Daniel delivered his completed engineering report. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't written to persuade anyone. It simply listed measurements, observations, photographs, and conclusions. The final paragraph was only 3 sentences long. The structural displacement was consistent with tracked construction equipment operating outside the original work corridor. The observed damage was inconsistent with ordinary aging, weather exposure, or deferred maintenance. In the engineer's professional opinion, the damage was avoidable had the originally approved access route been maintained. Daniel signed the report, closed the binder, and slid it toward Clara. I'm finished, he said. Now it's your turn. She smiled. Actually, she replied, it's the paperwork's turn. The following morning we attended a mediation planning conference with representatives from both sides. It wasn't the formal mediation itself. It was simply an opportunity to exchange evidence before anyone spent months preparing for trial. The HOA arrived with 2 attorneys, Vanessa, and 3 board members. I carried only the blue folder that had been growing heavier since the first envelope appeared in my mailbox. For nearly an hour, the discussion remained polite. Everyone agreed on dates, deadlines, and document exchanges. Then one of the HOA attorneys said something that changed the room. We're not aware of any written safety recommendation advising against the revised access route. Clara didn't respond immediately. She opened our folder, removed a single email, and slid it across the conference table. No speech. No argument. Just 1 page. The attorney read the first paragraph. Then he turned to the second page. His expression changed almost imperceptibly before he quietly passed the email to Vanessa. She read it more slowly. For several seconds, no one spoke. Finally, one of the directors leaned toward her. I don't remember seeing this. Vanessa answered without looking up. I do. The room became very still. It wasn't a confession. It was something almost as important. It established that the document had reached the board before construction moved toward my property. Clara calmly added the weekly coordination meeting minutes beside the email. Then she placed Daniel's engineering report next to both. 3 independent records. 3 different sources. 3 versions of the same story. No raised voices. No accusations. Just documents speaking one after another. The mediator, who had remained silent most of the meeting, looked toward the HOA's attorneys. I suggest everyone review these carefully before the formal session. Nobody disagreed. As we packed our folders, one of the board members quietly approached me near the doorway. He wasn't defensive. If anything, he looked tired. I voted for the shoreline project, he admitted. I honestly thought we were approving the original plan. I believed him. His voice carried none of the confidence I had seen at earlier meetings. It sounded like someone discovering his own signature on a decision he hadn't fully understood. Outside, Clara and I walked toward the parking lot without saying much. She waited until we reached my truck before speaking. Did you notice what changed in there? I thought about it for a moment. Nobody argued with the documents. She smiled. Exactly. She closed the blue folder and handed it back to me. Once people stop arguing with the evidence, they usually start arguing with each other. The next morning, the HOA's insurance carrier requested copies of every document we had exchanged during the conference, including one record that no one on the board had asked to see until the meeting was almost over. The executive session minutes from the night the alternate access route was approved. The insurance company's request arrived less than 48 hours after the mediation conference. Clara wasn't surprised. Adjusters hate surprises. she said as she forwarded every document we had already exchanged. If there's a decision to be made, they want the complete timeline before anyone starts rewriting history. We sent the engineering report, the field logs, the site reports, the contractor's emails, the coordination meeting minutes, the security video timeline. Finally, Clara placed one last document on top of the stack before sealing the package. The executive session minutes from the board meeting where the alternate access route had been approved. This, she said quietly, is the document they almost forgot existed. 3 days later, the insurance carrier scheduled individual interviews with every board member. That detail immediately caught Clara's attention. They're not interviewing the board, she explained. They're interviewing the directors. At first, I didn't understand why that mattered. Then she smiled. When everyone sits together, memories become group memories. When people sit alone, they only have their own. One by one, each director answered the same questions. Did you receive the contractor's recommendation? Did you understand the original county-approved access route? Were you aware the revised route moved heavy equipment closer to private property? Did you know the contractor recommended staying within the approved corridor? No one knew how anyone else had answered. There was no opportunity to compare notes. No chance to agree on a version of events. Only the documents sat in every interview room, waiting quietly on the table. Near the end of the week, Clara received a brief phone call from the claims examiner. She thanked him, wrote down 3 short notes, then hung up without saying much. I looked at her expectantly. Well, she closed her notebook. The timeline matches. Our timeline? No, she replied. Theirs. That distinction mattered. Until then, this had still felt like my case against the HOA. Now the insurance company's own investigation had independently reached the same sequence of events. The contractor identified the risk. The safer route remained available. The board approved a different route. The excavator stopped for authorization. Permission was given. The dock was damaged. Every document fit into the same chain without forcing a single piece. A certified letter arrived the following Monday. Clara read it once before handing it to me. Halfway down the second page, one paragraph had been highlighted by the claims examiner. Based upon the records presently available, certain project decisions appear to have been made after documented safety concerns were communicated to the client. Accordingly, the carrier reserves all rights under the policy while its review continues. I looked at Clara. What does that mean? It means the insurance company is asking whether every consequence of those decisions should be covered. She paused before adding, that's a question the board never expected anyone to ask. News traveled quickly through the neighborhood. Homeowners who had ignored months of rumors suddenly began requesting copies of meeting records. They weren't looking for gossip anymore. They wanted answers. Within days, residents began comparing the public meeting minutes with the executive session records that had surfaced during discovery. The difference was impossible to ignore. The public minutes simply approved the shoreline project. The executive session minutes documented the discussion about changing the access route, the contractor's concerns, the additional cost of the safer option, and the final vote authorizing the revised plan. One homeowner summed it up perfectly while standing outside the clubhouse. Those aren't 2 different meetings, he said quietly. They're 2 very different stories about the same meeting. The monthly board meeting drew the largest crowd I had ever seen. Every chair filled before the meeting officially began. People lined the back wall holding binders, printed emails, and copies of the executive session minutes. Even before the first agenda item was introduced, the atmosphere felt different. Not angry, focused. Vanessa opened the meeting with her usual welcome, but this time her voice lacked the confidence that had once filled the room. Routine business passed quickly. Nobody cared about landscaping contracts or mailbox repairs that evening. Everyone was waiting for homeowner comments. The first resident to approach the microphone was a retired civil engineer who had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 25 years. Without raising his voice, he held up the contractor's recommendation. I'd like to ask one question. He waited until the room became completely silent. Was this document in the board's possession before the vote approving the alternate access route? Vanessa adjusted the papers in front of her, but didn't answer. Instead, the association attorney quietly leaned toward his microphone. Yes, he said. No explanation. Just one word. A low murmur moved through the audience. The engineer nodded once and returned to his seat. Moments later, Another homeowner walked to the microphone carrying a copy of the executive session minutes. If the contractor warned the board beforehand, she asked calmly, why wasn't that discussion included in the public meeting minutes? Vanessa opened her mouth as though preparing to respond. Before she could speak, the attorney placed his hand gently on the folder in front of her. She looked at him. He gave the slightest shake of his head. The room fell completely silent. Nobody needed an explanation anymore. Everyone understood exactly why she wasn't answering. The truth had finally reached the point where it no longer required anyone to explain it. As the meeting adjourned, homeowners remained in small groups throughout the parking lot, quietly discussing the documents instead of rumors. Clara gathered her folders without saying a word. As we walked toward the exit, she glanced back at the nearly empty board table. They've spent months defending a decision, she said softly. Next week, they'll be deciding whether they can defend each other. The special board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening. Unlike the annual meetings that usually focused on budgets and landscaping contracts, this one had only a single item on the agenda: shoreline restoration and pending litigation. By 6 o'clock, the clubhouse parking lot was already full. Homeowners parked along both sides of the street and walked the remaining distance carrying folders, legal pads, and printed copies of documents that had slowly transformed from rumors into facts. I arrived a few minutes early with Clara. The blue folder rested under my arm, though by then it felt more like a habit than a necessity. Almost everything inside had already found its way into the hands of the insurance company, the mediator, and the board's attorneys. We took our seats near the back of the room. There was no reason to sit closer. The evidence no longer needed my help. Vanessa called the meeting to order exactly at 6:30. She looked composed, but not confident. There is a difference. Confidence fills a room. Composure simply survives it. After approving the minutes from the previous meeting, she nodded toward the association attorney. He stood, adjusted his glasses, and placed a single letter on the podium. The board has asked me to summarize the current legal position of the association. He spoke slowly, carefully choosing every word. Independent engineering experts had confirmed the damage resulted from construction equipment operating outside the originally approved access corridor. The contractor's records established that concerns had been raised before the route was changed. The executive session minutes documented that the alternate access plan had been approved after those concerns were discussed. Finally, the HOA's insurance carrier had completed its preliminary coverage review. He paused before reading the final paragraph of the letter. The carrier has advised the association that while certain property damage claims remain covered, decisions made after documented safety recommendations may fall outside portions of the policy's protection. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. The attorney folded the letter and looked toward the board. Independent counsel has recommended immediate settlement, full restoration of the affected property, and implementation of revised governance procedures to prevent similar failures in the future. For several long seconds, the room remained perfectly still. Then a homeowner in the front row slowly stood. He was the retired civil engineer who had asked the first public question at the previous meeting. This time, he wasn't holding the contractor's email. He was holding the executive session minutes. "May I ask one question?" he said. Vanessa nodded. He looked toward the entire board instead of focusing on any single person. "Before you voted, the contractor warned that the original access route was the safer option. Is that correct?" Vanessa glanced briefly toward the attorney. The attorney didn't answer for her this time. He simply nodded once. She looked back at the audience and quietly said, "Yes." The homeowner asked one final question. Were the homeowners ever told that warning existed before the vote? Vanessa lowered her eyes to the papers in front of her. "No," she answered. That single word carried more weight than any speech could have. No arguments followed. No raised voices. Just silence. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the sound of uncertainty finally disappearing. Another director leaned toward his microphone. "I relied on the summary presented during executive session," he admitted. "I should have requested every supporting document before voting." A second director nodded. "I should have done the same." A third quietly added, "We all should have." There was no effort to shift blame. No attempt to rewrite the timeline. Only an acknowledgement that convenience had been trusted more than careful review. The attorney then presented the settlement agreement. The HOA would fund the complete restoration of my dock and shoreline. The association would reimburse engineering costs, inspection expenses, and legal fees related to the claim. More importantly, every future capital project would require all engineering recommendations, safety advisories, and material project changes to be included in the public board packet before any vote could occur. Hidden discussions would no longer remain hidden. The motion was read aloud. This time, every director studied every page before speaking. When the vote was finally called, every hand rose in favor. Unanimous. Vanessa remained seated after the others lowered their hands. She reached into her folder and removed a handwritten statement. For a moment, it looked as though she intended to read from it. Instead, she folded it closed again. "I believe completing the project quickly served the community," she said quietly. Looking back, I confused speed with responsibility. She looked toward the homeowners gathered throughout the room. I should have listened more carefully to the professionals. I should have asked more questions. And I should have made sure every homeowner understood exactly what the board was approving. She paused before adding one final sentence. "At the conclusion of my term, I will not seek re-election." Nobody applauded. Public accountability didn't need applause. It only needed witnesses. 6 weeks later, the restoration crews arrived at my property. Their approach couldn't have been more different from the first project. Survey stakes were checked repeatedly before equipment moved. Protective ground mats covered the shoreline. Marine engineers inspected every stage of construction. Every adjustment was documented before work continued. Nobody relied on assumptions anymore. During the final walkthrough, the foreman pointed toward one weathered support beam carrying a faint pencil mark. "We can replace that if you'd like," he said. I ran my hand across the old wood and smiled. "No," I replied. "Leave it exactly where it is." That mark had survived storms, changing seasons, and one unnecessary legal battle. It had earned the right to stay. A month later, Rebecca brought my grandchildren to spend the weekend. The youngest hurried to the end of the rebuilt dock with a fishing rod almost taller than he was. His sister sat beside him, swinging her feet over the calm water while the evening sun settled across the lake. Watching them, I realized something that hadn't occurred to me during months of meetings and paperwork. The dock had never been the real victory. The victory was making sure the next family would never have to prove what should have been obvious from the beginning. Before we went inside, I opened the blue folder one last time. Every photograph, survey, receipt, engineering report, email, and meeting record was still there, arranged exactly as Emily would have organized them. I closed the folder, carried it into the house, and placed it on the highest shelf in my study. Hopefully it would never be needed again. But if another letter ever appeared in my mailbox, I already knew something the HOA had learned far too late. Confidence fades. Memories change. Paperwork doesn't.